Episode 1. The Arrival. They say the storm that night had no end, as if the sky itself was trying to drown the village. Windows rattled, shutters tore free, and the church bell, though no one had touched its rope, rang 3 times on its own. That was when he appeared. A man, drenched head to toe, stood at the edge of the square. No one saw him approach the road, no horse, no carriage. No lantern carried through the darkness. He was simply there, as if the storm had birthed him whole. His eyes were pale, almost colorless, and his mouth moved constantly, murmuring words that made the hair on the back of the neck rise. At first the villagers thought it was the rain, water running off the chapel roof, the groan of the wooden beams, but no, the sound was his. A language no one knew, every syllable sharp as broken glass. Mothers clutched their children tighter, and the old men crossed themselves, though their hands shook too much to form the sign. Then, without warning, the dogs began. Every hound in the village howled at once, as though they had seen something no human eye could bear. Their cries tore through the storm, wild and ragged, until the smallest of them dropped dead in the mud, tongue black and stiff. The man did not stop speaking. His lips moved faster, his voice threading through the thunder. When the innkeeper dared step forward and shout, "Who are you?" The stranger turned his gaze but gave no answer. Only more words, each syllable like an echo from a graveyard no map had ever drawn. That night a child died. Her mother swore she had only gone to sleep early, safe under blankets, her face calm as any other night. But when the storm broke at dawn, the girl was pale and stiff, her lips etched with the faintest trace of red, as though something had whispered into her mouth while she dreamed. And still, the man stayed. Standing in the center of the square, motionless, soaked to the bone, whispering in that language no one knew. And yet, everyone felt. His words didn't need to be understood to be feared. They burrowed into the ears, into the chest, into the marrow itself. The villagers gathered, trembling, too afraid to approach, too terrified to send him away. And as the sun rose behind torn clouds, he lifted his head and spoke louder, his voice filling every corner of the square. Not a single villager understood what he said, but every one of them knew, in their bones, that something ancient had just stepped into their lives, and it would not leave. Episode 2, the first translation. By the second day, fear had become a constant pulse in the village. People whispered in corners, staring from behind cracked shutters. The stranger had not moved from the square. His voice never ceased, rising and falling like the tide, an endless chant in a tongue that tasted like rust in the air. Most villagers avoided him, crossing themselves whenever they passed, but one man did not. Matteo, the old schoolmaster, had studied books most thought cursed. Parchment rescued from burned monasteries, scraps of inscriptions dug up with bones from the earth. His eyes were heavy with sleepless nights, yet when he heard the stranger's words, something in his memory stirred. He listened longer than anyone dared. His lips trembled, trying to shape the impossible sounds. And then, one evening, he whispered to the priest, "I think I know this tongue." They brought him candles, paper, and ink. Inside the chapel, beneath the watchful crucifix, Matteo began to write. His hand shook, not from age, but from the weight of the words. Each letter carved itself into the parchment like a wound. He translated only one line, just one. The words read, "When I am spoken, the walls shall remember blood." The priest went pale. He snatched the paper, tried to tear it, but the ink clung stubbornly, staining his fingers deep red. They argued in hushed voices until a scream shattered the night. It came from Matteo's house. The villagers rushed there, torches flaring against the dark. But the house was no longer whole. Flames roared from the windows as though ignited from within. No lantern had fallen. No hearth had burned too long. The fire seemed alive, feeding not on wood, but on words. From the crackling blaze, voices spilled, fragments of the same dead language, spoken over and over in tones too many for one man to hold. They pulled Matteo's body from the ashes before the roof collapsed. His face was frozen in horror, his mouth blackened, as if he had swallowed smoke that spoke back. The stranger still stood in the square, untouched by flame, his eyes fixed on the villagers who stared at him with terror. He did not smile. He did not move. He only whispered louder, and though no one understood, every soul knew. Matteo had opened the first door, and there were many more to come. Episode 3. The Whisper in the Church. The villagers could not bear it any longer. By the third night, their nerves were frayed, their prayers ragged. The stranger's voice had not stopped since his arrival, an unbroken river of sound that soaked into the bones of every living thing. So they dragged him into the church. It took 6 men to bind him, though he did not resist. He walked calmly, his lips still moving, his words dripping like poison into the silence. They lashed him to a heavy oak chair in front of the altar, chains tight across his chest and arms. His pale eyes followed no one. He looked past them all, as though speaking to something invisible in the rafters. Father Rodrigo stood before him, crucifix trembling in his hand. The priest had buried children, had faced plague and famine, yet never had he trembled as he did that night. "Enough," he commanded, voice cracking. "You will be silent in the house of God." But silence never came. Instead, the stranger's chant deepened, his voice curling low, resonant, shaking the very stones beneath their feet. The villagers pressed close to one another, wide-eyed. And then, his head tilted back, his throat opened, and a single, terrible phrase spilled out, louder than thunder. The church seemed to inhale. From the crucifix above the altar, Christ's eyes opened, not with the mercy of heaven, but with the weight of despair. Thick, dark tears spilled from the stone face, running down to the nailed feet. Women screamed, men dropped to their knees, some weeping, some clawing at their ears as though to rip the words away. "Stop him!" someone shouted. But when a villager tried to gag the stranger with a strip of cloth, the man only whispered harder. The cloth rotted in seconds, disintegrating in the villager's hands, leaving the stench of decay in the air. The whisper spread through the church like smoke. Those who heard it clearly fell to the floor, convulsing, eyes rolling white. They muttered fragments back, unknowing, as if their tongues had been hijacked by the language of the grave. Father Rodrigo clutched his crucifix and shouted prayers above the chaos, but each verse dissolved into a cough until his voice broke completely. He fell to his knees, staring up at the bleeding statue. The tears of Christ reached the altar steps, pooling in crimson puddles. The stranger's chains rattled, though he never struggled. His whisper had become the loudest thing in the church, drowning even the storm outside. And when the final echo of his phrase faded, a new silence fell, thick, suffocating, alive. The crucifix closed its eyes again, but the villagers knew. The church was no longer theirs. Episode 4. The Dream of the Dead. That night, no one in the village slept in peace. Even those who barricaded their doors and stuffed their ears with cloth found themselves dragged into the same abyss. The dream began the same for everyone. They stood in the church, though the pews were empty and the candles burned with black flame. The stranger sat still in his chains, yet his lips moved, spilling the same endless current of words. No one could hear them at first, but then the sound slid through the marrow of their bones, worming into their skulls. And they repeated it. All of them. Men, women, children, the entire village murmuring in unison, their voices joined to his. One by one they woke in terror, gasping for air, but the dream left something behind. On their skin, etched faintly, as though carved with invisible knives, were words, strange curling symbols bleeding just enough to stain the sheets. A mother screamed when she found her son's chest marked with a line of letters she could not read. Another woman clawed at her forearm until flesh peeled away, desperate to erase the word carved there. But the marks remained, glowing faintly in the candlelight, pulsing like wounds that remembered. By dawn, the entire village bore them. Every man, every woman, every child carried a piece of the language now, and it spread faster than fire. Old Mateo's surviving manuscripts were pulled from the ashes of his home. In the charred fragments, some villagers recognized the very same symbols now branded on their skin. The priest, trembling, refused to look too long at his own hand, where 3 words had appeared, stacked like a curse. He only whispered, "This is no dream. This is initiation." Meanwhile, the stranger did not sleep. He sat in the square, chained and silent for the first time since his arrival. Yet his silence was worse than his voice. He watched them all with eyes that did not blink, as if waiting for them to speak the words themselves. That morning, the church bell tolled on its own. 12 long strikes. No one touched the rope. No wind stirred it. The villagers understood. The dead no longer haunted their dreams. The dead were inside their flesh. Episode 5. the forbidden manuscript. The morning after the dream, the village moved like a body already preparing for burial. Faces were pale, eyes hollow, every movement slowed by dread. No one dared to speak of the marks on their skin, yet everyone knew they were there, pulsing like hidden hearts beneath the flesh. It was then that Diego, the blacksmith's son, stumbled into the chapel ruins carrying something pressed to his chest. His clothes were scorched, his hair singed, but his eyes burned with feverish certainty. From the ashes of Mateo's house he had pulled a book, half charred, its leather binding cracked, but whole enough to open. The priest took one look and nearly fainted. The manuscript was bound in stitched skin, older than any scripture they had ever seen. The letters inside were not written with ink, but with something darker, something that seemed to shimmer red when touched by candlelight. Mateo must have found it years ago, hidden beneath the ossuary, and studied it in secret. The villagers gathered in silence, circling the manuscript as though it were an open grave. No one dared touch it, save for Father Rodrigo, who crossed himself again and again before turning the first page. The words inside were the same as the ones the stranger whispered. Lines upon lines of impossible syllables, coiled and knotted across the parchment. And beneath them, small fragments, notes written by Mateo in his trembling hand. The tongue is not meant for the living. Every word opens a door. To finish the passage is to finish us all. Rodrigo's hands shook so violently the book nearly fell. But Diego caught it, clutching it tight, whispering, "If we understand, maybe we can stop him." The priest glared, his face white. Understanding is not salvation. Understanding is surrender. But the book had already taken hold. As they stared at its pages, some villagers swore they heard whispers curling from the parchment itself, faint but growing louder, as though the words were desperate to be read aloud again. And when night fell, the whispers became screams. Every home shook with voices no one invited. The marks on their skin burned red, glowing faintly in the dark. Children cried out in sleep, repeating words their parents could not silence. At the center of the square, the stranger sat in his chains. His lips moved in perfect rhythm with the manuscript, though he had never seen it. By midnight, one truth was clear to all. The book was not teaching them his language. It was reminding them of a language their blood already knew. Episode 6, The First Death by Voice. The night after the manuscript was found, no one in the village dared to sleep. The stranger's whispers had grown softer, yet somehow more invasive, like smoke seeping through cracks in their minds. And then came the boy. He was no older than 17, reckless with youth and swollen with curiosity. His name was Tomas, the miller's son. While others hid in their homes, Tomas lingered in the square, staring at the chained man as though daring him to speak louder. The stranger's pale eyes lifted, their gazes met, and Tomas, grinning nervously, whispered back. It was only 3 words, just 3, pulled straight from the forbidden manuscript, muttered like a joke into the stormy air. But the air answered. The sound of those syllables cracked through the square like lightning. The boy's voice warped, bending into something that no human throat should ever shape. The villagers rushed from their homes, drawn by the noise, and froze. Tomas stood trembling, his mouth open too wide, his tongue twitching like it was no longer his. Then, with a sickening snap, it fell. His tongue slipped from his mouth, wet and black, landing in the dirt with a thud that silenced even the storm. And yet, the voice continued. The words poured from his throat, though his tongue was gone, though his lips barely moved. A dozen voices, layered and ancient, howled from the boy's gaping mouth, each syllable vibrating in the bones of those who listened. His eyes rolled back, his body convulsed. His mother screamed, but when she tried to hold him, the same syllables burst from her lips too, tearing through her like a plague. She collapsed beside him, trembling, unable to stop the river of foreign words that now owned her tongue. The villagers scattered in horror. Some clawed at their ears until blood poured down their necks, desperate to unhear what had already taken root inside them. Father Rodrigo hurled the crucifix into the dirt, pressing the boy's head down with shaking hands, screaming prayers into the storm. But the prayers dissolved, syllable by syllable, until even the priest's voice faltered and bent toward the dead language. The boy lay still at last, his chest sinking into silence. But the echo of his voice lingered, humming faintly across the square, as though the earth itself was practicing the words he had spoken. The stranger remained unmoved, his chains clinking softly as he whispered anew. And for the first time, the villagers understood the truth. Speaking the language was not a mistake. It was a contract. And now, one of their own had signed it with his life. Episode 7, The Ritual of Silence. The death of young Tomas split the village in two, those who wanted to flee and those who wanted to fight. But flight was a lie. Everyone knew it. The language was not bound by roads or borders. It had already marked their flesh, nested inside their dreams. So the priest proposed something desperate. If his words bring death, Father Rodrigo said, his voice raw from weeping, then we must take away his tongue. We must bury his voice in silence. The villagers gathered, trembling as the plan took shape. They would forge an iron gag, welded shut so no whisper could ever escape. The blacksmith worked through the night, his hammer ringing against steel as though the village itself were screaming. By dawn, the device lay on the altar, a cruel mask of metal, glinting red in candlelight. They dragged the stranger into the church again. He did not resist. His eyes, pale and endless, followed them like shadows across water. The gag clamped over his mouth, the locks clicked shut, and at last, silence. For the first time since his arrival, the square was empty of sound. No whispers, no chants, only the restless beating of frightened hearts. The villagers wept in relief. Children played for the first time in days. The priest led prayers of thanksgiving. They believed, foolishly, that they had won. But silence is never empty. That night the dreams returned, sharper than before. Men woke with bloody throats from screaming words they had never spoken aloud. Women clawed at their own lips, insisting they felt something pushing to escape. The gag had not stopped the language, it had spread it. At midnight, the iron mask began to rattle. Though the stranger sat motionless in his chains, the gag shook violently, as though something inside his mouth was pounding to get free. A low vibration filled the square, rising from the earth, resonating through the walls. The villagers covered their ears, but the sound was not heard. It was felt, deep in the marrow. And then, worse than any whisper, came the silence after. Every rooster, every dog, every bird fell mute. The wind stilled. Even the crackle of torches died, their flames flickering without sound. The entire world seemed gagged. Father Rodrigo fell to his knees, clutching his chest, his lips moving in prayer. But no voice came out. Nothing. His words were gone. The villagers tried to scream, but their throats betrayed them. No sound, no cry, only silence, heavy and suffocating like drowning in air. The stranger's eyes gleamed through the bars of iron. He had no need to speak now, for silence itself had learned to scream. Episode 8, The Child Who Understood. For days the village lived in a prison of silence. No prayer, no song, no laughter. Even when they struck stones together, the sound of the spark did not come. The world had been muted by the gag on the stranger's mouth. But then she spoke. It was the orphan, little Inés. Barely 9 years old, she had always been quiet, her voice thin and timid. Yet on the third night of silence, she opened her mouth and whispered, and the whole village heard her. Not with their ears, but inside their skulls. Her words were not Spanish, nor Latin, nor any tongue known to man. They were his words, his endless chant, the language no one dared repeat. But from her lips, they flowed effortlessly, as natural as a child reciting a prayer learned long ago. The villagers recoiled in horror. Mothers clutched their children. Men crossed themselves again and again. But Inés only looked up with wide, innocent eyes and said softly in their own tongue, "He's not speaking to us. He's speaking for them." The priest demanded she stop, demanded she repent, but his voice was nothing, still swallowed by silence. He struck the altar in frustration, his hand bleeding. Yet the child only tilted her head, listening to something no one else could hear. "They're answering," she whispered. Her small hand traced the marks on her arm, the blood-etched letters that pulsed faintly in the candlelight. "They say the words are not curses. They are doors. Every one of us carries a door now." The blacksmith's wife fainted. The men dragged the girl away, locking her in the rectory. But even behind barred windows, her whispers spread. Children began to dream of her voice, echoing in their minds. Old men woke muttering her phrases without knowing. And then came the sign. The church bell rang, not by rope, not by wind. It swung on its own, heavy and furious. 12 times, 13. 14. Until the villagers realized it was not a count. It was a call. Inés pressed her face to the bars, her lips moving in time with the bell. Her voice carried like smoke through the square. "They're waiting under the ground." The gagged stranger lifted his head in the square, his pale eyes locked on the child's window. Chains rattled, the iron mask trembled, and every villager felt it, that the child was not translating him. She was joining him. Episode 9. The Grave That Answered Back. They thought the ground of the village was holy. For centuries their dead had been buried beneath the shadow of the chapel, their bones resting under consecrated soil. But after the bell tolled with no rope and the child whispered of voices beneath, the villagers no longer dared to step near the graveyard at night. Still, fear does not keep the curious away. A group of men, torches in hand, gathered at the gate. Among them was Diego, the blacksmith's son who had pulled Mateo's manuscript from the fire. He swore he heard knocking from below the earth, faint but steady, as though someone, or something, was trying to climb out. The priest tried to forbid it. His silent gestures, his desperate eyes, warned them of blasphemy. But desperation had already eroded their faith. If the child was right, if doors had been carved into their flesh, then maybe those same doors existed under the dirt. They dug. The shovels struck deep, mud slick against wood. At first it was just the scrape of metal against coffin, but then the sound came. Not an echo, not imagination. A voice. It seeped from the soil like vapor, rising up around them. A string of syllables, guttural and ancient, rolling across the night. The men froze, their torches trembling in their hands. Then the grave itself answered back, first one, then another, until every mound in the cemetery pulsed with whispers. It was not the voices of their loved ones. No grandmother calling, no child laughing, no father returning from the soil. These voices were older, deeper. They did not call to the villagers. They called through them. One man dropped to his knees, pressing his ear to the earth. His face went pale, and when he lifted his head, his eyes were wrong, hollow, as though scraped clean. He opened his mouth and spoke the language perfectly, without hesitation, without breath. The others fled, dropping torches into the mud, screaming without sound. Diego alone stayed, staring down at the opened coffin. Inside, the corpse did not move, but its mouth shifted. Teeth clicking against teeth, it formed words too old to belong to the dead villager within. The iron-gagged stranger rattled his chains in the square. His eyes closed, his head tilted back, as though he were listening from afar. By dawn, the villagers found Diego standing among the graves, his lips cracked, his throat raw. He did not look at them when they called his name. He only whispered in a voice not his own, "They have heard us, and now they will answer." Episode 10. The Blood Pact. By now, the village was no longer a place of life, but of waiting. Doors stayed barred, windows boarded. The air itself seemed heavy, filled with the weight of whispers no ear should hear. And in the square, the stranger sat chained, his iron gag rattling softly, as though something inside was gnawing at the metal. The priest tried to rally them. He held up the crucifix, his face gaunt, his voice still stolen by silence. He scrawled words in chalk upon the chapel wall. Resist. But even that word seemed fragile, too small to stand against the language that seeped from the ground, the sky, their very blood. It was the child, Inés, who spoke first. She slipped from the rectory in the middle of the night, barefoot, her eyes wide with a knowing no child should ever carry. She walked straight to the square and knelt before the chained man. "They told me," she whispered, "what must be done." The villagers, waking to her voice, stumbled from their homes and gathered around. Inés turned to them, her small hands shaking but steady enough to trace the marks that glowed faintly on her arms. "He cannot open the door alone," she said. "One of us must finish the passage. One of us must give blood to seal it." The crowd erupted in gasps and silent protests. Some shook their heads violently. Others clutched their children, dragging them back from the square. But the words were already inside them. They could feel them burning on their skin, crawling up their throats, waiting. Diego stepped forward, his face ashen but resolute. "If this ends it, if it spares us, then I will read." "No!" the priest tried to shout, but his voice cracked into silence. He grabbed Diego's arm, but the young man tore free, his eyes fixed on the girl. Inés handed him the charred manuscript. The forbidden pages fluttered open as though alive, stopping at the final lines. Blackened and wet as if ink had been freshly spilled, Diego began to read. The first word cut the air like a knife. The second made the torches flare blue. By the third, blood streamed from his nose, from his ears. Yet he did not stop. His voice grew louder, layered with others, as if 1,000 mouths spoke through him. The ground shuddered. Graves split open. The iron gag shook so violently it cracked, a thin line forming down the center. The stranger's eyes rolled white, his body convulsing in rhythm with the words. When Diego reached the final line, he screamed it. Blood poured from his chest in a crimson bloom, as though the words themselves had carved him open. He fell to his knees, manuscript clutched to his chest, his life spilling into the dirt. And in the silence that followed, Inés whispered, her voice calm, almost tender, "The pact is made." The villagers stared in horror. For though Diego's body lay lifeless, his lips still moved, reciting the passage again and again, his blood the ink that would never fade. Episode 11. The Night of 100 Voices. The night after Diego's sacrifice, no one in the village slept. They huddled together in their homes, candles guttering, prayers trembling soundless on their lips. Outside, the square lay drenched in Diego's blood, the pages of the manuscript soaked crimson, glowing faintly as though the words were alive. Then the voices began. At first it was one, Diego's voice, though his body was buried hastily behind the chapel. His tone rose from the soil, repeating the cursed passage with a rhythm that shook the air. But within moments, another voice joined, then another, and another. The villagers rushed to their windows in terror. All around them, the voices multiplied, filling every alley, every rooftop, every grave. Men swore they heard their dead wives calling. Mothers heard infants long buried crying in harmony with the chant. Even the wind seemed to carry syllables, each gust twisting into the language of the dead. Soon it was no longer a handful of voices. It was a chorus, 100 at least. The entire village vibrating with a hymn that was not holy but profane, a psalm of ash and blood. The people clamped their hands over their ears until nails drew blood, but it did nothing. The voices were not heard. They were inside. Their skulls became instruments, their bones hollow reeds through which the chant screamed. Men staggered into the square, raving, trying to shout above it. But when their mouths opened, the language poured out instead. Women clawed at walls, trying to carve the symbols bleeding from their arms into the stone. Children cried, not with sobs, but with syllables that bent the night sky into shivers. By midnight, the village was madness. Neighbors turned on one another, eyes rolled white, screaming the same words in 100 overlapping tones. Torches lit homes aflame, blood smeared across doors like signatures of surrender. Through it all, the stranger sat in his chains, his cracked iron gag glowing red, as though fire breathed inside him. His head swayed to the rhythm of the chant, pale eyes rolling back with something close to ecstasy. And at the height of the chaos, when the 100 voices seemed to tear the heavens open, Inés stepped into the square. Her small frame stood amid the carnage, her eyes wide but unafraid. She lifted her hands, and the voices bent toward her, as though waiting for command. "Their choir is not to destroy us," she whispered. "It is to welcome what comes next." The voices swelled, windows shattered, the church bell tore loose and crashed to the ground. And in the silence after the final toll, every villager understood. The 100 voices were not theirs anymore. They belonged to something that had just been invited in. Episode 12. The Last Interpreter. When dawn came, the village was unrecognizable. Ash clung to every rooftop, blood stained the cobblestones, and the air still trembled with echoes of the night's chorus. No rooster crowed, no child laughed, only the soundless weight of terror lingered. Father Rodrigo, hollow-eyed and trembling, gathered the survivors inside the ruined chapel. They looked to him for salvation, but his lips barely formed words. His voice had not returned. He scrawled a single phrase on the stone floor with a shard of charcoal. One must finish it. The villagers recoiled, shaking their heads, but they knew. Diego had only read part of the manuscript. The passage remained incomplete. Until it was finished, the voices would never stop. The doors carved into their skin would never close. And so the burden fell upon Rodrigo. He staggered to the altar, where the blood-soaked manuscript lay waiting. His hands trembled as he lifted it, the pages stiff with dried crimson. For a long time he stared at the words, the forbidden shapes that twisted before his eyes. Then, with a broken breath, he began. The first syllables burned his throat. The second blinded him, blood weeping from his eyes. By the third his knees buckled, yet still he spoke. Each phrase tore at his body, yet poured from him with the force of a tide that would not be held back. The villagers fell to their knees, some screaming silently, some clawing at their own faces as the language seared itself deeper into their flesh. Rodrigo kept reading. When he reached the final line, the church itself shook. Candles burst, walls cracked. The crucifix above the altar twisted, Christ's head turning sharply to face the priest, blood gushing from the stone wounds anew. Rodrigo choked, his body convulsing, and with his last shred of life he whispered the closing word. His chest tore open, blood spraying across the altar as though the word had carved its way free. He collapsed, twitching, eyes staring blankly upward. His lips, however, did not stop moving. Even in death, they shaped the final phrase again and again, an echo that refused to die. The villagers backed away in horror. They had witnessed his sacrifice. They had seen the passage completed, and yet the air was heavier than ever. The silence after his last breath was not relief. It was a pause, like the breath taken before a scream. The child Inés whispered from the shadows, "It is finished, but it has only begun." Outside, the earth groaned, the graves shifted, and something deep beneath the village stirred. Episode 13, The Man's True Name. The earth did not stop trembling after Father Rodrigo's death. It pulsed like a heartbeat, steady and relentless, as though the soil itself had veins. Graves split wider and cracks crawled up the walls of the chapel. The villagers huddled in the square, eyes hollow, knowing they had crossed a line that could never be undone. The stranger still sat in his chains, the broken gag hanging loose against his jaw. He had not spoken since the priest fell, but his silence was worse than his whisper. His pale eyes tracked the villagers, waiting, hungering. And then Inés stepped forward. Her small frame seemed fragile against the storm. Yet her voice carried as though the air itself bent to her. She pointed at the chained man and said, almost tenderly, "He is not a stranger. He has always had a name." The villagers froze. A shiver swept through them, for they understood instinctively what she meant. Names had power. Names bound things, gave them form. If his name had been forgotten, erased, or forbidden, then speaking it could shatter the last thread keeping him chained. The girl placed her hand over the glowing marks on her chest. They pulsed brighter, searing her skin. With a voice that was not hers, she began to speak. The syllables twisted through the air like smoke, each one heavy with centuries of dust. The villagers clutched their heads, some collapsing to the ground, their ears bleeding from the weight of it. Dogs howled. The bell, shattered on the ground, rang once more as though struck by an unseen hand. The chained man lifted his head. For the first time, a smile stretched across his lips, thin, cold, and triumphant. Inés spoke the final syllable. The sound did not fade. It cracked through the sky like a whip, splitting the clouds. Thunder rolled, though no lightning followed. Instead, shadows poured downward, slithering into the square. The name hung in the air, vibrating, alive. The man's chains shattered. The gag fell in two, clattering useless to the ground. He stood slowly, towering above them, his body thin but unbreakable, his eyes glowing like ash stirred from a fire. The villagers stumbled back, crossing themselves with trembling hands. But the gesture meant nothing. Their god was silent. Inés turned to them, her small voice breaking. "He is not here to speak to us. He is here to speak us." The man opened his mouth. His true voice bellowed, not a whisper, not a chant, but a roar of syllables so ancient the sky itself bent to them. And every villager felt their own mouths moving in unison, their tongues no longer their own. They had spoken his name. Now he would speak through them. Episode 14, The Silence That Screams. The moment his true name was spoken, the village ceased to be itself. The cobblestones cracked, the chapel walls bent inward, and the air thickened with a pressure that made every chest ache. The man stood unbound in the square, his shadow stretching unnaturally long across the houses, curling like smoke around doors and windows. His lips moved, but no sound came, at least not in the way sound should. Instead, the silence thickened. It pressed into the ears of every villager until they swore their skulls would split. They begged for him to whisper again, begged for noise to break the suffocation. But this silence was worse than any scream. It had shape, it had weight, it had intent. The villagers dropped to their knees, clutching their throats. When they tried to cry, nothing came out. When they tried to pray, the words fell apart before leaving their mouths. Even the bells of their minds were muted. But then, one by one, their silence betrayed them. Without moving their lips, voices erupted inside their heads. Their own voices, familiar but twisted, bent into the cadence of the dead language. Each villager heard themselves chanting, though they had not chosen to. The words marched relentlessly, echoing louder with each breath they could not take. Mothers clawed their faces bloody. Men smashed their foreheads against the earth to quiet the phantom roar. Yet the silence only grew more violent. A scream turned inward, shredding thought from the inside. Inez alone stood calm amid the agony. The child lifted her gaze to the unbound man, tears streaming down her cheeks, but her voice steady inside the silence. "They cannot stop it," she whispered. "The silence is their choir now." The man's pale eyes found hers. He raised his hand, and the silence pulsed like a heartbeat through every home, every grave, every body. And then, impossibly, the villagers began to move as one. Their mouths opened, their eyes rolled white, and in perfect unison they screamed the silence. No sound, no word, only the tearing force of a cry that made the world shudder. The chapel collapsed, the graves split wide, the sky cracked like brittle glass. And in the heart of it all, the man smiled, for the silence was no longer absence. It was his weapon, it was his hymn, and it was only the beginning. Episode 15, The Dead Language Lives. When the silence broke, it did not return as sound. It returned as dominion. The villagers lay scattered in the ruins of their chapel, their mouths open, their voices stolen, their eyes glazed white. But their bodies moved still, puppets caught in the strings of syllables too old to belong to the earth. Each step they took, each shudder of their breath, followed the rhythm of the man's unspoken hymn. He stood in the square, chains shattered at his feet, his shadow spilling across the village like an endless stain. His lips no longer needed to move. The language lived now inside every marked body, every cracked wall, every grave yawning wide. Children laughed in tones not their own. Old men wept with the voices of the unborn. Even the wind carried consonants, curling through broken windows, twisting around broken beams. The whole world had become a mouth. Only Inez remained apart. She stood barefoot among the ruins, her small frame trembling, her hands pressed against her chest. The marks on her skin blazed so bright they seemed carved from fire. "You gave them the words," she whispered, her voice trembling but clear. "And now they are no longer theirs." The man's pale eyes fixed on her. For the first time he spoke in a way they could all understand. His voice was deep, resonant, like earth groaning under weight too great to bear. "I did not bring the language here," he said. "I woke what was already sleeping inside you." And as he spoke, the villagers echoed him perfectly, their mouths shaping every word without hesitation. Inez shook her head, tears streaking her cheeks. She turned to the others, begging, pleading, but their faces were empty, drained of choice. They were vessels now, filled with something older than memory. The ground split open in the square. From the darkness below, whispers surged upward, countless and ravenous. The graves had answered, and now the world itself spoke. Inez fell to her knees, clutching her ears. Yet even inside her mind, the words clawed deeper, writing themselves into her thoughts. She realized then there was no stopping it. No prayer, no fire, no silence could kill it. The dead language had not come to die in their throats. It had come to live, and it would live through them, forever.
Epilogue, The Language Without End. Years passed, and the village disappeared from every map. Travelers who wandered too close found only blackened ruins. Graves split open like wounds, and a silence so thick it drove them back before nightfall. No bird flew overhead. No animal grazed near the borders. The place was abandoned, or so the world believed. But the language never left. It drifted outward, carried not by ink or parchment, but by breath. Traders spoke it in their sleep. Soldiers muttered fragments of it on battlefields before dying. Children in faraway towns woke screaming words their parents could not recognize. And always, the echo of that cursed village lingered in the stories, a man who spoke a tongue the living were never meant to hear, and a child who understood. Some say Ines still walks among us, her small frame unchanged by time, whispering the syllables to those who will listen. Some say the man himself cannot die, for his name has already been spoken into the marrow of the world. And if you listen closely, alone at night, when the wind rattles the shutters, you may hear it too. A whisper without breath, a prayer without God, curling into your ear like a secret you never asked to keep. The language lives, and once you hear it, it lives in you, forever.